The Mishnah in Perek HaOirig in Shabbos Koftal Dom Beis, the Mishnah tells us a halacha about someone trapping a deer, a tzod tzvi. The Mishnah says that if someone closes the door after an animal went into an enclosed environment, a bayis, according to Rabbi Yehuda, or a chotzer, a kino, a bivrin, according to the Rabbanon, any place which is designated by the Mishnayos as something which encloses an animal and traps the animal in a way that the person doing so is over on melechas צידה, the malacha of trapping an animal.
You gotta make me stop the video.
They are over for melechas צידה, they're over by closing the door. Closing the door itself is an act of trapping an animal, of keeping the animal enclosed into the area of the house, the area of his yard, his chotzer, his garden, his gino, his animal enclosure, which the Mishnah calls a bivrin. And that is enough to complete the malacha of צידה, of trapping, and to be mechayevim for a malacha on Shabbos. That's the first chiddush that the Mishnah tells us, the opening chiddush of the Mishnah, that closing the door in such a way that the animal cannot get out anymore is enough to be mechayevim. Says the Mishnah, what's going to be the halacha if there's two people who do the malacha? What's the halacha if they do it together? And that's the klal. The Olam's been learning the sugis of klalei malachas of Shabbos and malachas machshebes. To create a chashuv malacha, we paskin as 3 days in the Gemara. In the Mishnah is brought 2 days. The day of Rabbi Yehuda is the ikka day here, the Tanakame. That if it's zeh yochel v'zeh yochel, if there's a malacha that is done by a combined effort, 2 people do the malacha together, b'shutvus, they cooperate in doing the ma'aseh malacha, there'll be 2 people who close the door, then they're pater. Shnayim sha'asu, a malacha of Shabbos is only enough of a malacha, it only has a significance, a chashivus to be mechayev you in the malacha if you do it by yourself. If the malacha is done uniquely by one individual. If 2 people do it together, 2 people together doing a ma'aseh to cause a malacha, to trap, or any malacha in Shabbos, the halacha is, as long as each one could have done it by themselves, and each one is therefore considered to be helping the other one, it's only mesayea in the malacha because it would have happened by itself when the other one does it. That's the halacha. Rabbi Yehuda holds zeh yochel v'zeh yochel. If they both could individually do the malacha and they did it together, then they are part of. This is not a malacha that's mechayev you in Shabbos. If zeh eino yochel v'zeh eino yochel, if individually each one cannot do the malacha, and they need to come on to each other, and only because of the cooperation in the shutvus in the ma'aseh, that's how the malacha is done, then they are chayev. Reb Shimon says even in such a case it's pater. That's also called shnayim sha'asu. But we're going to focus on the shita of Rabbi Yehuda that zeh yochel v'zeh yochel shnayim sha'asu is pater. But if it's zeh eino yochel v'zeh eino yochel, if they could not have done the malacha by themselves individually, they needed each other, that cooperation of them both doing the malacha is enough to be mechayev them on the malacha and Shabbos. The Mishnah in and of itself seems to be a simple Mishnah, but we have a milsa de tmiyas, a tremendous question from a different Mishnah. There's a Mishnah in the Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis in Shabbos, where the Mishnah tells us about the malacha of a tzor and how much you have to carry in a Rishus HaRabim, or from a Rishus HaYochid to a Rishus HaRabim to be chayiv on a tzor. And the Gemara there brings a Mishnah which tells us almost exactly the same words. The Mishnah says, if 2 people carry something together in such a way that they each could have done it, zeh yochel v'zeh yochel, then they're pater. That's the din of shnayim sha'asu on Shabbos, that they're pater. If it's zeh eino yochel v'zeh eino yochel, if each one could individually not have done the malacha, and they need to cooperate to be able to have the malacha happen between the 2 of them, then they are chayev. And Reb Shimon parties that this is the ikka shita of Reb Yehuda, that zeh yochel v'zeh yochel, if individually they could do the malacha, then they are pater. Shnayim sha'asu is a ptur on Shabbos, And if ze eine yochel v'ze eine yochel, if individually, uniquely, they cannot do the malacha, then they are chayiv when they do the malacha through their combined effort. And this chura, we have a big problem here, because we know that the Mishnayos are written where each Mishnah has to tell us a chidush. You cannot have in the same Masechta two Mishnayos that tell me exactly the same halacha. The fact that one of them tells me the halacha in the malacha of haitzah, of carrying, and one tells me a malacha of צידה, of trapping, does not make two different chidushim kipshutai. So why do I have a Mishnah in Tzadik Gimel Amud Beis telling me the halachas of Shnaim Sha'asu in the malacha of haitzah, and I need another Mishnah to tell me exactly the same halachas of Shnaim Sha'asu with regards to the malacha of צידה? Once I know from the Mishnah to the Gimel Amud Beis that Shnaim Sha'asu is potter on Shabbos in the case of Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel, and in the case of Zeh Ein Yochel v'Zeh Ein Yochel it's chayiv, why do I need to repeat exactly the same klolim, the same dinim of Shnaim Sha'asu with regards to the malacha of צידה? This kasha is asked by Gelley Achreidim already, the Tosis Yomtiv is oimed, but no one suggests a compelling teretz. They say, ba'ofen doichak, they work out why maybe Rebbe decided to give us another try and another Mishnah to tell us the halacha of Shnaim Sha'asu. Now, there's even a bigger question over here in this subject of Shnaim Sha'asu. The Gemara in Tzadik Dal Amud Beis, when the Gemara is discussing the din of Shnaim Sha'asu, the Gemara closes Shaila. The Gemara says, the Mashal Gemara discusses in Shittas Remeya. We're going to see the Rach tells us that the Shaila is also in Shittas Rabbi Yehuda. Remeya holds that Shnaim Sha'asu is chayiv even by Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel. Even if each one individually could do the malacha, if they do it together, they're still chayiv. Rabbi Yehuda, we said, holds in that case it's potter, but if they do it in such a way that individually they could not have done the malacha, then they're chayiv, because they couldn't have done it by themselves. Klad the Gemara HaShaila. The halacha is, in most malachas of Shabbos, the malacha has a share, how much you have to carry in the Rishos HaRabim to be chayiv, how much you have to cut, you have to be kaitza to be chayiv, how much you have to be mavashal to be chayiv. There's shiurim in every malacha, how chashuv the malacha has to be, how much you have to do to the malacha to make it a dava chashuv to be chayiv. Every malacha, the malachas of Mishkan, which the Torah asks, Malamates malachis, they're all because they are significant malachas. We'll see why this is so important for the deeper understanding of all malachas Shabbos. But the malachas of Shabbos, Avedis, become part of the Aveda of Leisasa Kol Malacha when they are significant in such a way that they have a shem of a malacha. There was an action which had tremendous impact. And for that impact, the halacha of shiurim, that's how much you have to do to generate the required impact to be called a malacha. And every malacha, or most malachas, have a shir. We're saying that two people could have it combined, a joint effort to do a malacha. They could carry in Rishos HaRabim, and the shir of Eitzah Rishos HaRabim depends on what you carry, if it's a dava chashuv in this Eitzah. And what happens if they carry only one shir? There's only one side, one item that they carry, where one person who carries this in Rishos HaRabim, one person who's over the malachas haitzah with this shir is over, because that's chashuv enough for him to be chayiv on malachas haitzah. He did a full haitzah with that shir alone. But what happens if two people are doing the haitzah and they're chayiv because we're in a situation where Shnaim Sha'asu is taka chayiv? The fear of Meir by Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel, and the fear of Yehuda only by Zeh Ein Yochel v'Zeh Ein Yochel. I'll call upon him. We're discussing a case where Shnaim Sha'asu is chayiv. Klad the Gemara, do you need to say that since we're trying to be chayiv two people, so then each one can only be chayiv if there's a full haitzah for him? You mechayiv two people, so you need to have two shiurim of haitzah. One shir haitzah is not enough to be mechayiv two people. Well, no. There's only one malacha of haitzah happening. It's happening al yedei two people. So the one malacha is enough to be mechayiv both. but I don't need to have a unique share to be mechayev each one individually, because the way that oiv on the malacha is, because each one is participating in a full malacha, as long as I have enough of a share for the ikka malacha, and the malacha is considered now a full malacha, each one participated enough in that malacha to be mechayev him, even though there's only one share. That's the shaila of the Gemara. And it's a machlokes Amayron. And the Gemara brings a raya. The Gemara says, I have often a Mishnah in Malachas Tzeda, the Mishnah that we started off with. The Mishnah says that if two people, in a case of Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel, if two people will trap a deer by both together closing the door at the same time, they close the door together on the deer by such trapping the deer, they're chayiv. Now the share of tzeda, we would all assume naturally, says the Gemara, is one live animal. Every live animal is a share of tzeda. So if there's two animals and they close the door together, that's a share of tzeda. Each one has his own. But the Mishnah doesn't say there's two deers. The Mishnah says there's only one. So if two people close the door on one deer and I see that they're chayiv, I have a raya muchrachas that in the way shnayim sha'asu is chayiv, I do not need to have a share l'chol echad ve'echad. It's enough that I have a share in the malacha, and the malacha is happening mitzad the malacha. There's a share which is always enough to be mechayev one person, and when two people together do the malacha, it's enough to be mechayev both, even though there's only one share. The raya of the Gemara is a tremendously compelling raya, and we have to understand what's pshat in anyone who's chaylik. There's a maram who's chaylik. How do they deal with the often a mishnah of tzeda? Now, Tosfos has an easy way out. Tosfos says that the Gemara in Shiurim, when the Gemara discusses Shiurim, is in the man the Amar Reb Meir, who holds that even Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel is chayiv. And the Mishnah of Tzeda is in Rabbi Yehuda, that Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel is chayiv, but Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel is pater. Says Tosfos, I could be mechalek. I could tell you a spalt between Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel, where over there maybe you need a share for everyone, and Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel, that you need a share, you do not need a share for everyone. Which means Tosfos wants to have that there's a difference between Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel and Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel, not just in degree, but in kind as well. It's a different way of being over on the din of Shnayim Sha'asu. When you have Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel, so then the malacha is complete in and of itself, and everyone's participating in that malacha, and that's enough to be mechayev them. So even if there's only one share, it's enough. Mash'ekin is Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel, each one is doing a malacha that they could have done by themselves, and each one's only mesayeh for the other one. Even though Reb Meir says that you're chayev, each one is chayev, there's a chayev misa for each person involved in the maisa of Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel, but still, over there, if I have one share, then it's as if they're both joining each other in the one share, so they only have a half a share individually. If they'll have a unique share, then it'll be possible to be mechayev them. That's the shaila of the Gemara in Reb Meir of Zeh Yochel v'Zeh Yochel. But in Reb Yehuda of Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel, then Tosfos is stipulating a svara that then it would be pashut, and that's why it's not a raya. I said this a little quicker because this is not the ikka of the share, that's Tosfos. But Tosfos brings from the Rach, from Rabbeinu Chananel, that the Gemara shaila is in Reb Yehuda and in Reb Meir. The Rabbeinu Chananel did not have this chiluk, and he holds that in Reb Yehuda and in Reb Meir, the Gemara is clear. The Gemara has a shaila. Do you need a share oitzah by Shnayim Sha'asu? Even though we have an often a Mishnah which the Gemara brings that by tzeda a share of one animal is enough to be mechayev both. And it's mamish tomua. Tosfos asks the kasha, how could you have a shaila in Rabbi Yehuda by Zeh Eino Yochel v'Zeh Eino Yochel, whether you're chayev on one share or you need two shiurim to be mechayev both participants in the malacha, when by tzeda there's often a mishnah that you're chayev even though there's only one share and they're both chayev. But often, let's repeat the kasha briefly and then put it on the side till we get a teretz. The kasha is two kashas. We have two mishnayos, a mishnah in the malacha of Eitzah that tells us the halachas of Shnayim Sha'asu, that sometimes it's pater, sometimes chayev, and the same halachas of Shnayim Sha'asu are repeated by the mishnah of tzeda by trapping. And now we have two questions. First of all, why do you need two Mishnayos? And second of all, why can I not learn the Shiurim? Why can I not infer the Shir of Melacha, of Shnaim Sha'asu, from trapping, from Tzeda to Hoitzah? It would seem that the two Mishnayos are totally irrelevant. They do not impact on each other. We cannot learn one from another. There's no Chidush. There isn't one Chidush that I could learn from the other, and I can't even learn the Shiurim of the Melacha of Shnaim Sha'asu from one to another. What is the pshat that these two Mishnayos, which are telling us exactly the same halacha in the Klal of Shnaim Sha'asu, just by two different malachas, and I see that they seem to be irrelevant. They seem to be telling me different halachas, not the same halacha. That's the kasha that we'd like to address after the Yesodis in Malachas Tzeda and in Shnaim Sha'asu. So first I'd like to discuss a little the malacha of Tzeda. The Mishnah, the opening Mishnah in Malachas Tzeda, brings a machlokes to the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda. When one traps an animal, how does one trap an animal ba'ofen that is called the malacha of trapping? The Chachamim say, as long as the animal ends up being trapped in a tight enclosure, makes no difference what it is. As long as it's within walls, it cannot run away. Shabura says, even if you lean over the animal in such a way that you're trapping it with your body, it doesn't have to be in walls. As long as it's enclosed and confined and it cannot move the way it would want to move freely because you're stopping it or you put something there to block its movement, that itself is enough to be over Melech's Tzeda. Rabbi Yehuda says, and this is Mavu and the Bach and the Taz, Chidush that I'm going to say, Rabbi Yehuda says, even if you put it into a chotzer, a yard, that's not a behemoth's natural habitat, and therefore, that's still a behemoth's natural habitat, and therefore, it's not a malacha of tzeda. A malacha of tzeda is when you get the animal to go into a house, a bais, you trap it into a house is not an animal's natural habitat. The yesod of malachas tzeda is that a behemoth belongs outside. If you put him inside, so changing his surroundings, getting him from being free outside to being trapped inside, that's the malacha. But only because you changed where he belongs. He belongs outside and you stuffed him into an inside place, into a bais, into a house. He's an undomesticated animal which you're trying to domesticate. But if you have an animal and you allow him to roam inside a chotzer, which is somewhere where animals could belong. It's not a shinui, it's not a change of where the animal should belong, it's not a change of his natural habitat, that's not a malacha of tzeda. And the Bach and the Taz say in Rabbi Yehuda, that even if the house is a large house, and the animal could roam around the house, and he's not confined exactly where you could pick him up and take him to yourself, you're still over on malachas tzeda, because the ikka yesod of tzeda, Lefi Rabbi Yehuda, is to switch the natural habitat of the behemoth from one way he's outside where he belongs to being stuck inside the house. Obviously, if he could run out of the house, he's not stuck, so he's not in the house. He's just happens to be walking around there at the present moment, but that's not where you changed his place. But if he's stuck in the house, that's what it is. And that's pshat in the Rabbi Yehuda. And the Chachamim would seem that that's not the Yisod of Malachas Tzeda. Yisod of Malachas Tzeda is just to make sure that he's confined and enclosed and where you could pick him up at will. I'd like to show that even in the Chachamim you have this Yisod. There's a Moedik Lashon of Rashi, of the Rach, and the Rambam in Yad, when they discuss Malachas Tzeda, the Meirich and Meirich L'Shoinam, how the person was Oiseh Tachbulois, and he took a trap and he forced the behemoth to run this way and that way until he was matrid. He tired out the behemoth and he got him inside the house. I put together a few of the Lashonis of these Rishonim, but the Rishonim are categorical. They're telling us how the trapper, how this person was over on Malachas Tzad, how is he over on Malachas Tzad? He trapped the animal, he chased the behemoth all the way into the house, and then he closed the door. And it's L'chure, Hadava Tomua. Why are the Rishonim and the Rambam Lahalacha describing how one traps an animal? This is irrelevant to the Malacha. Since anyway, all the Rishonim tell us that if you don't close the door on the animal, he won't be trapped. If you chase an animal, chase him for 10 miles and you get him into the house, but the door still remains open, that's not a malacha of tzeda. You didn't trap him. So all the chasing and the tachbulis and the matrid the behemah was not a malacha. You weren't over any malacha. You didn't do a malachas tzeda. He's not trapped because he's not stuck in the house because the door is open. Now let's go the other way. What happens if the behemah is in the house already, or he walked into the house of his own volition, and then you trap him? You close the door on him. Are you over? We learned that was the opening Mishnah that we discussed today. Closing the door is enough of a malacha. Closing the door is enough to be mechayiv malachas tzeda. So why is the Rambam getting us involved in how he got into the house? If he's in the house already, the closing of the door is a full malacha. If you don't close the door, you're never going to be over the malacha. So chasing him into the house isn't even a chelik of the malacha kipshutai, because I don't need that chelik. I don't need to chase him into the house. He could run into the house himself, and as long as I close the door, I'm chayiv. And since I always need to close the door, even if I chase him into the house, surely all we should say is that closing a door on an animal is an act of tzeda, and that is enough to be mechayiv, and that is always what I need, and it's always enough. Why is it important at all to tell me how I got him into the house? Really, the kasha is on the Mishnah. The Pri Megadim is medayik that the Mishnah said that sod be'chayol lebayis, the Gemara says. That lashon lamed akiruvi says sounds like the malacha is that he's outside the house and you got him into the house. But the same kasha stands. It's a kasha now, not just on the Rishonim. The Rishonim came from a Mishnah, but it's a kasha on the Mishnah. Why is the Mishnah describing the transition from outside to in when the full and complete malacha happens all the day, closing the door and trapping him and blocking his exit? That is the kasha. To answer this kasha, I'd like to be makdim shita of the Magen Avraham. There's a Mishnah, another Mishnah in Tzeda. We've almost gone through all the Mishnahs of Tzeda. It's not such a long malacha in the limud of the Gemara. The Mishnah says that if someone sits in front of an open door where an animal's inside, that's a malacha of Tzeda. If the person was sitting there, let's say from before Shabbos, and he walks away and someone else comes into his place, then the second one's not over a malachas tzeda because the behemoth was already trapped. He was already in a matzav, in a situation where he was stuck in the house. And the second person just was mamshech. He continued the matzav of tzeda. He allowed the behemoth not to have an exit, but he didn't block off his exit because he took over from the original person who was already sitting there. Frek the Tosis Yom Tov Akasha. Tosis Yom Tov says, but when the first person moves aside, then for that 1 second or even 1 millisecond, there wasn't an exit. There was a way for the behemoth to get out. And when this person number 2 jumped in and closed off their entrance using his body to block off their entrance, he did a new meister of tzeda. He blocked him off. So now the Mishnah should be mechayiv the second one tzeda. Why is the second one potter? Because he only continued the tzeda. He didn't continue it because for a second it was off. So Tosis Yom Tov says you have to have like the Anoni HaKavod. You have to have that the person never actually moved away. The way number 1 and number 2 switched places was in such a way that the first one came from inside the house and blocked the door in front of person number 1. So when number 1 moved away, number 2 was already standing there and there was no gap. There was no pause even for a second. An easy pshat in the Mishnah. The Magen Avraham is cholik, la'alocha. The Magen Avraham says that even if there will be a second's pause, even if number 1 will move aside and then number 2 will come, number 2 will not be over malachas tzeda, and that's the pashtus of the Mishnah. Why? Says the Magen Avraham, since he was already trapped inside the house, the animal was already inside the house and he was trapped in the house, because number 1 moved away, he didn't become in a situation where he's not trapped anymore. It's not as if he's out of the house, he's still there. He just had an exit. He had a way to get out, but he didn't take his opportunity. And person number 2 moved in, but that's not a new ma'aseh tzeda. You didn't trap him from the beginning, so to speak. You just continued the matziv. It's a hemshech of the tzeda because the behemoth didn't become in a situation where he's not trapped. His trapped status remained even though it was possible for him to get out of the door. And all the Achronim jump on the Magen Avraham. They say, we don't know what you're talking about. If to make an animal into a status of being trapped, you have to get him into the house and close the door. That means that when the door's open, he's not trapped. So as soon as the door's open, whatever situation you had till now is over a bottle. We have to rework how we're going to view the situation, and it's a situation of not tzeda. It's a situation where the behemoth is not trapped because he could run out. So now when you stand by the door, number two should be chayiv, like the Tosis Yom Tov. How do we understand such a shver in Magen Avram? A Magen Avram that says that as soon as the behemoth is stuck in the house with the door closed, you can open the door and he's still trapped. If you need a door to be closed to make him trapped, so when the door's open, then he's not trapped. How do you split the two? Where's the dichotomy over here? Where's the spalt to make that you need to close the door to make him trapped, but opening the door doesn't undo the situation where he's trapped? And I think the answer is, like we said from Rabbi Yehuda, the Shittas Rabbi Yehuda, and we're going to borrow it from the Rabbanon as well. Besides for the trapping, which is initiated, the malachas of tzeda, which one is over, al yadei, putting the behemoth into an enclosed, a tight captivity where you could always take him for yourself, and that's possible even when it's not in a house. That's possible even if he's in an animal enclosure, in a bivrin. But if he could have roamed around by himself, and you now enclose him into a tight space where he's more tachas yodcha, he's more by you in your rishos than in his own rishos, that's one type of tzeda. But if you take him from his natural habitat, like we said, and you put him into a house, that itself is a malacha of tzeda that the Rabbanon are masking too, that's the ikka of the tzeda when you get him into a house, is the fact that he's not anymore in his own natural habitat. He's in a place where he doesn't belong. He's stuck inside the house. But, like we said in Rabbi Yehuda, if he's in the house but the door's open, he's not stuck in the house. He happens to be walking inside the house like he could walk outside. But if he's not stuck in the house, that's not a tzeda, because he didn't change his habitat at all. He lives outside, he belongs outside, and now, in the present, he happens to be taking a shpatzia, he's touring your house. If you close the door and he's stuck in the house, al kapanim, if he's stuck in a confined environment in the house, the chachamim, that's enough to activate the tzeda, which is the tzeda of not being in his environment. So we're coming out that there's two tzedas. If you trap him into his natural environment, then the tzeda is the fact that he's enclosed and confined in your rishos. Masha'enkein, if you get him into a house, and this is what the Rishonim was saying, when you trap an animal and you chase him and you force him to get into a house, that itself is a malachas tzeda. That is a full malacha of tzeda. It's not a half a malacha. It's a malacha of tzeda, because the tzeda is, the trapping is, that you changed his natural habitat, and you did. You took him from being in the outside and you got him into a place where he doesn't belong. But it's only called a tzeda, it's only a gemar of tzeda if the house holds him in. If the house is a house where he's now, where it's changed where he belongs. That it's not just that he's outside of his natural habitat and he's in a place that he doesn't belong, but it's a place that doesn't belong where he can't get out of that place. If he can get out of that place, so then he's not stuck in the place where he doesn't belong. So that's not called a tzeda, even though he's where he doesn't belong, but he could get out of it. But if he's in the place where he doesn't belong, which is the tzeda, and he cannot get out of that place, now you were going with the malachas tzeda, but the tzeda that you were going with is not a tzeda of trapping him in such a way that he's by you. The tzeda is being in the house. Because he's in the house, that's why he's trapped. In a house where he can get out of is not called in the house. But once he's in the house, the tzeda is the fact that he's in a house because he doesn't belong in a house. And that's what the Magen Avram means. Says the Magen Avram, once he's in the house and the door is closed and he's trapped in the house became his new place. The house became where he doesn't belong in the house. But he's there. When you open the door, you're not undoing the tzeda. If the tzeda is because he cannot roam around, because he's not on his own free will, because he's stuck in a very confined area. So when you open the door, he's not confined, so you undid the whole tzeda. Masha'enkein, if the tzeda is being in the house, when you open the door, he's not out of the house. So you still have the ikra tzeda. When you do the tzeda mitchila, he's not called trap because he didn't get stuck in the house without closing the door. But once he's in the house and it's nigmar that now, so to speak, he belongs in the house where it's not natural for him, but that's where he belongs. Opening the door and allowing him out doesn't change the ikra tzeda, which is getting him into the house. Ke'ilu, for those who haven't learned tzeda, and the Havana still needs time. I'll just say it in a nusach that we're used to from other areas. That it's like it's a t'nai. That means the ikka of the malacha is getting him into the house, because the house is by definition somewhere where he doesn't belong, and it's a specific type of tzeder being in the house. But it's a t'nai. He's not in the house in such a way that it's a malacha unless you close the door. But once you close the door, closing the door is not actually the ma'aseh malacha. The ma'aseh malacha is getting him into the house. And therefore, when the door's open, just because you don't have any more the t'nai of the malacha, that doesn't mean that you're oika the whole malacha. You didn't lose the malacha. You just don't have any more the t'nai, but the t'nai was a t'nai in how you're over. But you didn't take away the malacha. You didn't take away the ikka impact of the malacha, which is getting him in the house. And therefore, when the next person comes and closes the door, he didn't do a tzeder, because the tzeder is getting him in the house. He just did a t'nai. Doing a t'nai is not enough to be over on the malacha. That's how we're going to answer the Magen Avraham. And we have beautiful pshat in the Rishonim who describe to us how the trapper got the animal into the house. They're not telling us a story. They're telling us what the ikr of the malacha is. They're describing the actual malacha. Closing the door is not a malacha. You need to close the door. When you close the door, an animal will go into a chotzer, like the Mishnah later. Over there, closing the door is the whole malacha because you're trapping him in a confined environment. Masha'en came by a house. When you close the door, you're not doing the malacha. You're just making that he's trapped. You're finishing off the malacha. But if he was already trapped, then closing the door is not going to be a malacha, because that's just the t'nai of the malacha. It's not the malacha itself. And therefore the behemoth already has the malacha done to him. The impact of the malacha is still kaim. And therefore closing the door will not be enough to be mechayev the number two who stands by the door, kafi the pshat of the Magen Avraham. And even those who are chaylik, Allah dafka chaylik from the Yisod, we're saying in Malachas Tzeida's bias, they'll just hold that opening the door does undo the whole Tzeidah, a svara. But the Yisod we want to have from the Rishonim in the Magen Avraham, that could be the Kula Alma, that the Ikka Malacha, the Maisa Malacha of the Tzeidah is getting him into the house. And the closing the door is a T'nai. If we say like this, we'll answer a Moedik Kasha that everyone asks on the Magen Avraham. There's an Ofna Tosefta. The Tosefta says that if you have a chotzer with two entrances, the Tosefta just takes you through the motions. If one person stands by, there's an animal inside the chotzer, but he can get out. There's two entranceways. If one person stands by a doorway, he's not over because he can still get out of the other side. Mr. Number 2 goes on entranceway number 2. Now, Mr. Number 2 is over because now we can't get out because both sides are trapped. Says the Tosefta, if the number 1 will leave and then he'll come back, now he'll also be over. So we have an Ofna Tosefta that, not like the Magen Avraham, we have an Ofna Tosefta that even though the behemoth was already trapped, if you open the door, you create an exit for the animal to get out, and then you block it, you're over. But for what we're saying, we could answer that the Tosefta is going in a chotzer. A chotzer is a place where you can only have a tzeidah if you actually trap the animal into a confined environment. And when you open the door, he's not nitzud anymore. You've lost the whole impact that you had. Masha Enkein, the Magen Avraham is discussing a case of a house. In a house, that's where we're going to say this Yisoi. And the Magen Avraham, Avada will hold that if you got him into your house on Friday and on Shabbos you close the door, it'll depend on this. If you closed the door on Friday already, this is what the Achronim are dealing with in the Magen Avraham. This is what they're fatainet on him. They say, the Magen Avraham is coming to say a huge kula in Malachas Tzeidah la'alacha, that if you have an animal trapped in your house on Friday and the door was closed on Friday, then you could open and close the door on Shabbos, and you don't have to worry that every time you open, he's not nitzud anymore. So when you close it, you're trapping him. And the other achrayim hold that's not true. However, even in the Magen Avraham, if the door was open the whole Friday and then you close the door on Shabbos, then you'll be over on Shabbos, because then you're going, because he was never a nitzud before. He was never in a situation of tzida. But if the door was closed, then the tzeda was finished. Now, once it's nitzud, closing the door is not itself an act of tzeda. It's only going to be goyim the alter tzeda. Who once the alter tzeda was nigmar already, you're not doing anything when you close the door on him again and again. This is the yesod in Melech's tzeda that I'd like to be mechadish, and this has helped us for the Toises Yom Tov to explain the Magen Avraham and to explain the Rishonos of the Rishonim. And smach l'dava, I found in the Yereim, in the Sefer Mitzvahs, where the Yereim goes through all the Lamates Malachis, he delineates what's a Av Malacha and what's a Tolda. By Tzeda, he says the Av Malacha of Tzeda is trapping. What's the Tolda? The Tolda is closing the door on an animal inside your house. They have to understand, well, why is closing the door a Tolda of Tzeda more than trapping? If the Av Malacha is closing off the behemoth into a confined environment, what's the nafkamina if you do it with a trap, with a dedicated trap, or you just close the door? Yeah, there's a way how to explain the Yereim differently. The parish at the bottom as a mahalach. But the pashas of the Yereim, I'd like to say, is with what we're explaining now. Since the Ikka Malacha of Tzeda is getting him into the house, so this halacha that with the gemara of the tzeda, just with the t'nai, just with closing the door, that's also enough to be mechayiv. That's a told of tzeda. That's not the ikra malacha. That's a way out to be over. But you didn't do the actual trapping. The animal who walked inside maybe trapped himself. You just closed the door on him. That's a told of tzeda. Ashenke, the ikra of tzeda would be when you get him into the house. That's the ikra of tzeda. Obviously, if you get him into the house without closing the door, then you didn't get him into the house. You got to get him into the house and close the door. But then you'll be doing an Av Malacha of Tzeda. If you just close the door, it's a tol. This is a Yisrael Malachas Tzeda. I'd like to move into the Malachas Machshavas of this, which will bring us back to our opening questions in Shnaim Shas. The way we've explained now that the Ikka of the Malacha, when you get him into the house, is that he's in the house. That he's, you switch to where he belongs and you put him into the house. And closing the door is like a T'nai. L'chura, we should ask a question. We know in all malachos of Shabbos that you're only over if you do a ma'aser, a siyo hu da'aseh, hagrama shari. If you're only a goyim for the malacha, you're not over on the malacha. It's not a malacha to be over on. We'll see soon exactly the Agdarim it's Hashem. So now we have to ask the question on ourselves. If the ikka of the malacha is getting him into the house and closing the doors like a t'nai, but really, he's already in the Makom HaTzeda before you close the door. Closing the door is just to make that the house is a type of a house which encloses him into it. A house that he can get out of is not a house where you were goymer, where he's out of his natural habitat. It's only when you close the door. But the ikka of the malacha, even after you close the door, is where he is in the house. If so, l'chura, we should apply to closing the door the halacha of grama, the halacha that on Shabbos, grama is pater. He didn't actually do anything. He didn't do the malacha. The malacha happened by itself. If the animal went inside the house by itself, the animal did the malacha. It's not finished. It's not complete. It's not. I'll give you a mashal. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're only over if the animal's in a house, not if he's in a chotzer. If he's in a yard, you're not over. What happens if you have an animal in your yard and you bring your couches into the yard on Shabbos? And you say, you designate, now the yard is a house. You eat your sudas there, and your yard became a house. Instead of being a yard, it's a house. So now the animal is trapped in an environment that's not the animal's anymore. You encroached on the animal's environment and took it for yourself. Is anyone going to say that you're over melechus tzeda? That's mamish a grama. You took where the animal was and you made that into a place which is a place that makes the animal into not in his natural habitat. The same way into a house. He's in the house already. But he's in the house in such a way that he could get out. So I don't see how he's in the house where the house became his natural habitat. But once that's the ikar malacha, and you're just closing the door on him, the closing the door is not doing a malacha on Shabbos. The closing the door is making that being in the house is a malacha. But if you didn't do that part, he did that part. So all you're doing is making that what he did should be a tzeda. That's like a grammar. How are you over for such a thing? I'd like to get to answer the grammar kasha soon. But now that we're hot on the grammar kasha, I'd like to say over Remei Simchas Torah. We're saying it maybe a little different, but it'll give a starka avana to what Remei Simcha is doing. Remei Simcha knows Sameach to answer the Shnaim Sha'asu kashas. We have two kashas. Why do I need a Mishnah of Shnaim Sha'asu by Tzor and by Tzeda? And why don't I learn that if the share of one animal is enough by the Malach of Tzeda to be Mechayiv two people, it should be enough to be Mechayiv two people who do Tzor? Those are the two kashas. Teretz is, it's Cholok B'Yesoid, the din of Shnaim Sha'asu in the Malach of Tzeda, and the din of Shnaim Sha'asu in the Malach of Tzor. In the Malach of Tzor, the ikar of the Malacha is the Maisa, of the Gavre, is what you're doing, the carrying that you're doing. In fact, in Tzor, the Achronim discussed that there's not even much of an impact at all, because the impact is not an actual shinui, it's not a transformation of the chefza that you're carrying, it just changed its place. But the Ikka Maisa is the Malacha of the Gavra, you're carrying. So the Shnaim Sha'asu is a Shnaim Sha'asu in where the Malacha is taking place. Two people are doing the Malacha together. Masha'enkein the Shnaim Sha'asu of Tzedeh, which the Mishnah is discussing closing the door, like we said, the closing the door is not the Malacha. The closing the door makes that the Malacha is finished, that the malacha is complete, that the malacha is the malacha of tzeda, which you could be chayav for. It's the t'nai for the malacha that already took place. Like we said, a malacha means the significant impact that makes something one of the lamates malachas, something they did in the Mishkan that has significant impact. The significant impact is that he's in the house, and that was done already. But you have it tonight that it has to be a house that's closed. You've got to be in a closed house, not an open house. Says Remei Simcha, when they join together to do a malacha, when they do it together, it's much easier to say the potter, because the malacha, by the ikra malacha, is a shared malacha. So who said that's enough of a malacha to be over on Shabbos? Masha'enkein by tzeda the malacha is complete in and of itself. They're not sharing, they're not participating in the malacha. Where are they participating? They're participating in the ma'aser that brings the malacha to completion. They're participating in the t'nai that makes that the malacha is a malacha. Let's say it in a lomdish ha'ofen. I want to explain a little more, but to be able to say it, if they're only doing the t'nai, why are they over? They didn't do the malacha. The teretz is that the malacha is misyachis to the person who does the t'nai. The person who finishes off the malacha, it's considered the malacha that he did. It's considered he had enough input because he caused the malacha to happen. Causing the malacha itself to happen is itself enough to be mechayiv you, even though you didn't do the malacha. The impact, the shem of malacha, which is the significant impact, that happened by itself. The deer ran in by itself. Closing the door is the gemara of the malacha. Closing the door makes that you're now the person who finished off the malacha. You're the person who sort of owns the malacha today. You took over the malacha for yourself. You made that ma'aser malacha a ma'aser malacha that's chayiv on Shabbos. But since you're only over for causing it to happen, you're only over for making that the malacha should be a malacha. Who made it should be a malacha? Both of them. I don't see that they participated in making it into a malacha. They participated in the act that brought the malacha into fruition, into completion. But they didn't participate in the malacha. So even though I know already that two people doing the malacha, b'shutvos, is not a malachas maxheves, it's not a chashuv malacha, that's when the malacha itself is shared. But if only what brings the malacha is shared, I don't know that that's enough to be potter. So I need another Mishnah to tell that to me. That's Remei Simcha's Chidush. And that will also answer the kasha on the Rach. The Rach says that by Shnaim Sha'asu, even though I know that there's a shir that one day is enough to be chayiv for tzeda, I don't know how much you need to be chayiv by Otzor. That's because by tzeda, the shir is in the malacha, and the malacha doesn't have a Shnaim Sha'asu. The day trapped himself. He did the ikka malacha. He did it himself. He walked in on his own volition. So the shir, which is always, like we said before, the shir is how to build the impact and the significance of a malacha. Since anyway the maisa is not part of the significance of the malacha, the maisa is a maisa just to get there, to own the malacha, to be misyachas to the malacha. Therefore, the shir is always going to be a share of one, because as long as I have a malacha, the two people participating are participating in a complete malacha. Masha'enkein by Otzor, where they're participating in a malacha, so maybe I need two shiurim to have kilu a double malacha, that there's enough malacha to be mechayev both of them to say that they each did a malacha. But if there's only one share, how could two people do a malacha? To makeh patish on tzeda is a hard Indian. You got to see the meiri over there. You got to know why there's no makeh patish on every malacha. Every time anyone does a malacha, the one who finishes off is a makeh patish. But the whole havana of what a malacha tzeda is, it shouldn't be shaykh makeh patish. But that needs the havana of what makeh patish is. That needs arichas. In the one of the hardest malachas to understand what exactly makeh patish is and what they did in the Mishkan that's mechayev us when we have a makeh patish. That's the yisoid of Ramei Simcha, beautiful yisoid to be mechalik. It's sort of a counterintuitive svara. When there's a grama, it's more mistaber that Shnaim Sha'asu should be chayiv. Because where there's a grama, two people who are goyrim, each one is like a full goyrim. Because anyway, you're only over for the grama. So who cares? Someone else did it with me. I was goyrim a full malacha and he was goyrim a full malacha. We did the maisa together. When two people join in doing the maisa, the ikar malacha, so then the malacha itself is a split malacha. Maybe that's not enough to be mechayev each one. Svara of Ramei Simcha. Just like to understand in the context of Ramei Simcha what we said before, the same kasha we had, and we're going to ask it on Ramei Simcha as well. If it's true that the malachas tzeda over here is, so to speak, happening all day at Gromet, the malacha is being in the house, and he's in the house already. And closing the door is like a t'nai to make that malacha should have impact. Then taka let it be a ptur of grama. Why taka you chayiv? Mimanav shach. If the halacha on Shabbos is that you're only over on the malachas Shabbos because you did an act that's a malacha. Chazon Ish says that you cannot compare the halachas of Nezikin to the halachas of Shabbos, even though both require an act. But by Hezek, he says, to define the hisyachsos, to define who did the action of a Hezek, of damaging someone else's property, because ultimately what we care about, what we're mechayevim for, is the damage, is the impact of damage. Therefore, the way how he's over on his maisa is always, I'm done the impact of the maisa more than the maisa itself. As long as he made that impact, that's enough to be mechayevim. Masha'enken on Shabbos, even though, like we said, you need impact for the chashivas of a malacha. If there's no impact, there's no malacha. But what we're upset about, the aveda, is not making the impact. The aveda is the malacha. His lashon is tirchas ha'adam b'malachtoi, the maisa, what we call in the yeshivas the uftu, what you tu oif. The impact is there to generate a chashivos that what you did was something significant. But you're not over because you made a field plowed. That's not what you're over for. We don't care that field shall be plowed on Shabbos. We don't want you to do an action which is such a strong action, it has such a significant impact. But it's the action that you're over for. And therefore, if you're goyrim, even though you have the impact, but that's not enough of a ma'aseh. It's not enough of the action that the Torah doesn't want on Shabbos. So, Mimanav Shach, what's Ramei Simcha saying? He's comparing it to Hezek. In that piece, I didn't have time to say it over, but he's comparing to Hezek and Shnaim Sha'asu. If we're going to say that it's not enough of an action to be called a malacha, so then you're a goyim. If it is enough of an action to be called a malacha, so whatever the action is, that's the malacha. And therefore you did it yourself. What's the nafkamina that what you did was closing the door and you didn't do an action in the body of the animal, you did it outside the body of the animal. But if this is the action that's called the malacha of Shabbos, so then you did it together with someone else. If it's not the action that's called the malacha of Shabbos, then you're a goyim because you didn't do the action of malacha Shabbos. So how are you going to be over here? We said just beautiful Torah, but how's this compatible with the Ikar Halacha that on Shabbos a malacha is good for the Maisa and not a way how to make an impact that's misyachas to you? The malacha is the Maisa itself, and where over here is the malacha going to be the Maisa? If we're saying that you don't do the Maisa malacha with closing the door, you're only doing something which is a side part of the Maisa, tnai of the Maisa, a way how to get the house to be a matzav of tzeda, but not the Ikar malacha itself. And over here we have a Yisoid in Malachas Tzeda, a beautiful word that brings worlds together, where Baruch Beh, the Kamenetz Rosh Hashiva in his Birchas Shmuel, explains a Yisoid from the Avnei Nezer. Dr. Baruch Beh, he's coming to explain why it's mutter to set up a trap on Erev Shabbos, which is going to trap an animal on Shabbos. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to set up a trap, even though the animal is not being trapped the second you set it up. Avnei Nezer understands that if you set up a trap, which you know will trap an animal within the next few seconds, you're chayav for a malachas tzeda doiraisa, even though you didn't do anything. You just set up a trap and it ran in. Behechrich, that when it runs into the trap, I'm done, that setting the trap is a malacha when the animal comes in. That itself is a malacha, because you need to have a malachas Shabbos to be over a malachas Shabbos. When the behemoth runs in, you didn't do a malacha. So where's the malacha? When you set up the trap. So that's good for a malacha, setting up a trap. And the maisa happens when the animal runs in. If so, it should be asa to set up a trap on Erev Shabbos, because setting a trap on Erev Shabbos that traps on Shabbos is also making that there should be a maisa malacha on Shabbos. Because you're doing now something which, when it traps on Shabbos, that's the Maisa Malacha for when it traps. Says Baruch Beh Yisoid from the Avnei Nezer that Tzeda is different to all other malachas. All other malachas, and he explains it in the Miluim on Birchas Shmuel over there in Baba Kama, all other malachas, the reason why I need positive impact from a person, I need a Maisa, that Groma is part because I need his Maisa, is not just because otherwise it's as if he didn't do it. The reason why Grom is Pata is because the Chefza of the Malacha, the Shem Malacha, like we said, that there's a Chashivus to a Shem of a Malacha. The impact, the significant impact needs the positive input of a person. And when there's no positive input, it's not a Malacha b'chtal. It lacks the significance of a Malacha when there's no positive input. Mashen can't say there, maybe because that's the way how trappers trap in a field. That might be why. But Tzeda is cholok from all other malachis. In Tzeda, the reason why a goyim is pater is because I don't see that he did the act. If he'll just be goyim at Tzeda, then I don't see him as part of the ma'aser that even caused the malacha. But the malacha itself, the significance of malacha, the shem of malacha, does not need positive input from a person. It's not like every other malacha. Even though the malacha, that means the impact of the malacha, the behavior becoming trapped happens by itself, the animal traps itself, I don't need to see where the person's input of setting the trap made that malacha. Even if the person's input is not what made it, and I'll be done, that it happened by itself, it's still called a malachas tzeda. Once it's a malachas tzeda, the way had to be over, the way it should be mesyachis, the way to coin the malacha for yourself to be over is al yidei setting the trap. That's enough of a ma'aser to be over a malacha. But it's not a ma'aser that makes the malacha into malacha. It's the ma'aser that allows the malacha, the malacha that's in and of itself a malacha without your input. The setting the trap allows you to be over on that malacha. That's how Baruch Beh explains how malachas tzeda is different to other malachas? If so, let's get back to the Mei Simcha, what we're saying in closing the door. In a different type of malacha, we would not be able to say this, because we would have to say that if closing the door is called an input into the actual trapping, so that's itself a Maisa Malacha. And if it's not, so then you didn't do the Malacha. The trapping will not have significance, because you need an input of a person into the Malacha to make it a Malacha. Masha'enke, by Tzeda, I don't need that. By Tzeda, I don't need his input for the Shem of the Malacha. The Malacha happens because it's trapped by itself, and it's called a significant impact of being trapped. I just need that he should own the Malacha for himself. I need it should be Misyachas to him. For that, if he does the Maisa of Ne'ilas Delos, that's enough of a direct Maisa that, of course, that's not a Groma. He's not a Goyrim. Like when you set a trap, you're not a Goyrim in setting the trap. That's the Maisa that brings to the trap, to the behemoth being trapped. Closing the door is a direct Maisa that brings to the behemoth being trapped. So you're going to be over for closing the door, even though closing the door is not a Malacha. And the Malacha didn't happen through your direct input for the Shem of the Malacha. But since the Shem of the Malacha of Tzeda can happen without direct input, the direct input that you have, which is not a grama of closing the door, is enough to be over on Tzeda. But now we understand beautifully the Chiluk is Shnaim Sha'asu. Baruch Ben himself says that Shnaim Sha'asu will depend on this. If, like other Malachas, where the direct input of the Gavra is what makes the Malacha, so then if two people are putting in direct input, so the malacha itself is happening through both of them. So it's a shared malacha in the Shem of the malacha. That's like two people doing half a malacha each. Like by Haitzah, where one will be oikam, one will be maniach. It's mamash not a malacha. I don't see one malacha happen. He did half and he did half. Because the ikka malacha needs direct input, and there's a shared direct input. Masha'enkein, by Tzeda, the direct input is not what makes the malacha. So the malacha happens in and of itself, and there's no shnaim she'asu in the malacha. So the malacha is not shared. The malacha is significant in and of itself, even with one shir. The shnaim she'asu is only in where there is direct input, which is the ma'aser that brought to the tzeda, which is why you're over on Shabbos. It's the unique malacha, the only malacha where you're over for a ma'aser, which is not a ma'aser malacha. It's a ma'aser which brought you to a malacha of Shabbos. That's how Baruch Beis explained it, and this mahalach is bringing us back to the Revei Simcha, that even though Avad is not a grama on Shabbos, it's a grama b'nogeya to the Shema Melacha. That means the Etzema Melacha, the chashivus of a Shem Melacha that other Lamed Ches Melachis need to be called a Melacha, that they need direct input. Over there, it's called a grama. But I don't need, it's not a direct input for the Melacha, but I don't need a direct input for the Melacha by Tzeda. Where I have a direct input is in the mice of closing the door. And that closing the door is going to be the mice that's machayev me on Shabbos, and I need a new Mishnah for, they say I'm over on Shnaim Sha'asu, and I found for the Rach, like Ramei Simcha, that the shear of one tzvi is only by a case where the chashivus HaMalacha happens in and of itself. But if the Malacha is a cooperation, if the Malacha is a shutvos, then it's very mistaber, then I need the shutvos to have two shiurim, that two people can have a significant malacha coming out of both of them, and one is not enough. So b'kitzur, we said a yisoidin grame and malachas machshebes of Shabbos from Baruch Beis, that every malacha, the direct input is necessary for the shem and the chashivus of malacha. Masha'enkein tzeda, the direct input is only for the maisa of the person, but the malacha doesn't need direct input for a chashivus. We said the chidush in Shnaim Sha'asu, and Shnaim Sha'asu is also totally on whether it's in the Malacha or whether it's just in the Maisa. There's two types of Shnaim Sha'asu, and we use this to ve'emfa the kasha on the Mishnayos. Say why I need two Mishnayos, and say what's trapped in the Rach, that's not a raya from the Mishnah of Tzeda to the Mishnah of Haitzah. And on the way, we said the Yisoid in Malachas Tzeda, that the Ik of Malachas Tzeda doesn't always have to be the actual enclosing the behemoth into a confined place. The Ik of the Malachas Tzeda could be changing his natural habitat, and that will be the Yisoid of Malacha. And with that, we ve'emfid the kasha of the Achreidim on the Magen Avraham, who holds that when you open the door, an animal that's inside the house doesn't change his status of trapped because he's still trapped because the ikka trapping is that.